Hey, there's a song by Leanne Womack about a bunch of advice being given to a younger person. And the main line in the song is, if you get a choice to sit it out or dance, I hope you dance. We could spend quite a bit of time on the way David celebrated before the Lord. He danced like no one was looking, full of exuberance and joy. And some of us find that difficult to do. I don't dance like no one's looking, even when no one is looking. It's just not me. And I don't like risking ridicule. It's a kind of a personality thing, but David didn't care. Now, of course, the way we all are has a lot to do with how we celebrate things. And we could discuss why some people think there's no real joy without some outward physical movement. And other people get more excited about a cup of coffee. At least they show more excitement about a free cup of coffee than they do about God. And let's be honest, some people look pretty glum even in church, and you would think that a funeral was going on. There's a wide variety of the way people express emotion. But that's not really the point of this passage. The dancing of David, dancing like no one is looking, is because of joy at what God has done. So we need to look at this passage from the cause of David's joy, the work of God in establishing David as king on the throne and being present among his people. David's joy is in God. We looked at 1 Chronicles for some additional details when you did your questions, but we're going to focus our discussion on chapters 5 and 6 of 2 Samuel, so open your Bible to those chapters. All of Israel came to Hebron to make David king, and 2 Chronicles gives lists of the fighting men from each tribe who came, but 2 Samuel doesn't do that. The people have three reasons that they give for why they chose to make David king. First, he was their flesh. Second, the Lord, he has been the one who has led them into battle and fought for them. And third, the Lord has appointed him shepherd over Israel. So David makes a commitment to them. He's 37 years old at this time. He's been king in Hebron for 7 years, since the age of 30. David decides to move his capital city. Now, this is a really good idea strategically. It would make for a more peaceful transition between the dynasty of Saul and the current reign of Ishbosheth, which just came to an end, and David's reign. He chooses Jerusalem, which is kind of on a border area between the territories that Ishbosheth and Saul had ruled and Judah, where David has been for the last 7 years. And so it's kind of more neutral. But there's a problem, because Jerusalem's not in the hands of any of the Hebrews. It's not a town that belongs to Saul. It's not a town that belongs to David. It belongs to the Jebusites. Now, the Jebusites were a warlike people, and Jerusalem is up in the mountains. The Jebusites were one of the Canaanite nations. In fact, they were one of the nations that conspired against Gibeon way back in Joshua 10. Joshua and Israel had defeated the army and the king when they battled on behalf of Gibeon, but they didn't go and take the capital city. And so the Jebusites have remained in Jerusalem for all of these centuries. It belongs to them. The Jebusites say, no one can get in here. We could leave the blind and the lame guarding the walls and you wouldn't be able to get in. They're very confident. And we're told in 1 Chronicles 11 some further details. David says they're going to have to use the water shaft to enter the city. David says whoever leads successful entry will be named commander of his army. Now, you might have wondered about that. I mean, Joab's been the commander of his army for quite a long time, led his mighty men in battle, but David is now king over a larger area, and he's incorporated a bunch of other soldiers and commanders into his army. And so he might have thought this was a fair way to name a new commander and establish that new commander. But Joab leads the conquest of Jerusalem, and so he is named commander of the entire army of David. So David establishes his new capital city in the walled city, that fortress he calls the city of David. This is on a hill known as Mount Zion, across a shallow valley from Mount Moriah. This hill, Mount Zion, It became a name associated with the whole of the city as the city grew, and actually has even become a name associated with the eternal city in heaven. We're not told if God told David to go there or not, but one fact from the time of Genesis 22 makes it seem as if it is the will of God that Jerusalem be the capital city. Mount Moriah, just a stone's throw away from Mount Zion, is where Abraham offered Isaac. And so it fulfills the symbolism of the sacrifice of Isaac for God's son to be sacrificed in that same area, possibly on another end of the hill of Mount Moriah. And at the time of David, his fortress is on a neighboring hill, Mount Zion. Solomon's temple will be built on Mount Moriah. And by the New Testament time, the city has spread to incorporate the Temple Mount and Mount Zion, all within the confines of Jerusalem. The Jews think the altar of burnt offering is on the actual place where Abraham offered Isaac. Then chapter 5 tells us that the king of Tyre sent David supplies to build himself a palace. David's been waiting a long time for God to move on his behalf. He's probably wondered sometimes what God is doing and why it's all taking so long. But now suddenly God seems to be moving really rapidly, and a lot of things take place quickly. So 1 Samuel chapter 5, we're going to read verse 12. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. God established David, and not for David's sake, but for the sake of the nation. Having established David among his own people and given him a capital city, God now establishes him in terms of enemies of Israel. So beginning in verse 17 of chapter 5, the Philistines come and try to search for David. They're probably feeling pretty betrayed. David has lived among them, seeking sanctuary from Saul in their midst, and supposedly fought on their behalf for all of this time. And now he's king of Israel and he's their enemy. And so they come against David, and David goes to the stronghold, and the Philistines are down in the valley. In verse 17, David inquires of the Lord. And God tells him to go and fight the Philistines, for God will surely turn them over to Israel. So David does. This is a direct attack, and David wins. But the Philistines flee. They leave behind their idols, and Israel gathers them up, but they try again. They come again. And in verse 23, David again inquires of the Lord. And this time the Lord gives him different instructions. He tells David not to go out in a direct head-on battle, which worked before, but rather to go around behind them, to attack them from some poplar trees. There's this odd instruction in verse 24. They are to attack when they hear the sound of marching in the top of the poplar trees. What is that? We have no idea. Is it a sound made by wind? Is it the sound of the armies of heaven marching to fight on David's behalf? We aren't told. But David obeys. He hears the sound. He attacks, and he beats the Philistines again. They are struck down. And this is the last major problem that Israel will have with this nation during the reign of David. This eliminates the biggest enemy of Israel at the time. God is firming up David's hold on the throne in the eyes of his people and against those who are his enemies. God has a purpose for David, and he has a purpose for the nation, and God establishes David in externally visible ways in order to fulfill that purpose. God establishes his people to fulfill his purposes and for the blessing of others. It is God who puts his people where he chooses. He has a purpose for you, and he's going to establish you according to that purpose. He might give you a public ministry or a hidden one. It's up to God to decide that. But God does not establish us in an area of service or in a position for our own fun or our own self-advancement. He always does it for the sake of others, for the good of others. None of us are islands. None of us is given a place so that we can boast or be proud. It's always for the blessing of others. David was called to be shepherd over Israel, as the tribes reminded David when they came to make him king. Shepherds spend their lives working on behalf of their animals. It's a selfless position. And this is how God calls us to serve others as a shepherd. Is there some area of service to which God has called you? You can be sure that as you trust him, he will establish you in the purposes he has for you. But it won't be for your benefit. It will be for the blessing of others. Will you ask God to show you how you can serve in such a way as to benefit others or to benefit them to a greater extent than you already are? And if you're waiting for God to steer you into his place of purpose for you, how are you viewing that process? Is it scary? Are you wanting to sit it out and forgo obedience to God? Or are you willing to step forward strategically into his purposes and throw yourself into the dance? David faced the same situation 2 times close together. 2 battles, same enemy. These confrontations with the Philistines, but he did not assume the second time that he knew what to do. He inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord gave him different instructions. Because the issue was not so much on how to attack. The issue was on dependence and obedience. David depended on God, not his former successful methods. It's not a particular method of fighting that brought David to the throne and gave it to him. It was God. God has established David in the eyes of his own people, given him favor with some other nations, such as Tyre, and eliminated his greatest enemy, the Philistines. He has a new capital city, and everything is going awesomely. But there is more establishing of David that needs to be done. Not just external things, but there is some internal spiritual establishment that has to take place as well. So this is what we find in chapter 6. David has, David has a desire to bring the ark of the Lord to Jerusalem. And that's good. It'll be among the people in a central location. David can inquire of the Lord there. The ark has been for 20 years in the home of Abinadab, and it's been there since the Philistines returned it to Israeli territory back in 1 Samuel chapter 6. David has the right intention, but he uses wrong methods. He makes a new cart, and he moves the ark the way the Philistines moved it when they returned it to Israel. Now remember what the ark is. It's a wooden box covered with gold. Inside are 2 tablets of stone on which God had engraved the 10 Commandments, a bowl of manna, and Moses' rod. The cover of the ark is a solid gold lid called the mercy seat. It has a gold cherubim with outspread wings over it, and the ark represents the presence of God. Israel is excited as the ark comes to Jerusalem, and everyone is celebrating, and then it all goes wrong. The ark the cart that the ark is on reaches the threshing floor, and the cart wobbles. The ark seems to rock, and Uzzah puts out his hand to stabilize it, and God strikes him dead. David's first reaction is anger. It's like David says, wait, we're doing the right thing here. We're bringing the ark. We're trying to keep it from dropping to the ground, and you killed him? I wonder if David felt this was unfair. I wonder if he thought God owed him better than this. David has a perception problem. He perceives the holiness of God and the seriousness of sin as both being a little bit less, maybe a lot less, than they actually are. And he perceives that human effort and good intention earn something from God, that he rewards us by overlooking small things. The sin here of moving the ark in a way that is different from the explicit instructions that God had given. And in thinking that God is not holy and that we can't just treat the ark the way we would a glass of water that teeters on the edge of the table and we make a grab for it. David didn't understand the vastness of God's holiness, and he needs that to be reestablished in him. David processes this a bit, and his anger turns to fear. Have a look at chapter 6, verse 9. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? He thinks, the Lord's too holy. How are we ever going to be able to get the ark to Jerusalem? So he left the home in the ark, in the home of Obed-Edom, and it was there for 3 months. David hears that God blesses Obed-Edom because of the ark. And David realizes that there is a reward, there is blessing for the presence of the Lord if he is honored correctly. And so he decides to try again to bring the ark to Jerusalem. First Chronicles gives us a few more details. David finds out that priests must carry the ark on their shoulders. So he has the priests consecrated, and this time they bring the ark to Jerusalem the proper way. There is huge rejoicing. David celebrates a bull and a calf every 6 steps that they take. That is a massive undertaking. There is dancing and instruments, and the people are rejoicing. There are appointed singers singing songs of praise. And 1 Chronicles 15:26 says, the Lord helped the Levites who were carrying the ark. He would need to, because it's a long uphill climb through the mountains to Jerusalem. David takes off his outer garments, his kingly robes, and he's only wearing an undergarment, a linen ephod. And he dances with all his might before the Lord. He is rejoicing that the Lord will be among them, rejoicing the ark will be in Jerusalem, celebrating everything God has done. The whole nation is filled with joy. And so he brings the ark to Jerusalem and sets it up in a tent. And David goes home to bless his household. He has blessed the people with gifts, and now he's going to go home and bless his family. But his wife, Michal, has seen him dancing, and she despised him. And she says some nasty words to him. Chapter 6, verse 20, the last part of the verse. How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. You can just hear the contempt dripping off of her. But David doesn't pull any punches in his reply. Verse 21. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me, rather than your father or anyone from his house, when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by those slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. David is not ashamed of celebrating the goodness of the Lord, of expressing his joy. He's going to continue to do so, and his dignity doesn't matter to him. He's going to dance no matter who's watching. The final verse of the chapter says Michal never had any children. Now, we don't know if this event drove such a wedge between them that David never lay with her again, or whether the Lord closed her womb. These events are important in the establishment of David. He needs internal establishment. He needs to be established spiritually in the truth of who God is. God is holy. He cannot be casually approached. But knowing him in the fullness of who he is results in joy. Huge, overflowing joy and blessing that flows out to all people. God establishes us so others experience his presence. David is a picture of Jesus and his work of redemption. Jesus wants us to choose him as our king, just as Israel chose David. The kingdom of Jesus will be established and it will not be shaken. Jesus will bless his people and bring them joy. Being in God's presence brings joy, uncontainable joy. Israel experienced this as they brought the ark back among the people. As we experience the joy of the Lord and worship him as he is, we bring the joy of the presence of God to others. We reveal him to those around us. We show his glory when we enjoy him as he is. What would your interactions look like this week if it was your priority that others experience God's presence through you? What risk of faith is he asking you to take to align yourself with his kingdom purposes so that others can be blessed? How do you respond when others criticize you? What concern about how you appear would interfere with expressing the joy of the presence of the Lord to those around you? God established David, and God confirmed his work in David and in his kingship in a variety of ways. He confirms his work in us in the same way. God's work is confirmed when it's recognized by the community. Israel recognized that what God was doing in bringing David to the throne. So too, others will notice what God is purposing in you. This is part of your confirmation of his establishment of you. Others will notice and recognize and identify his call. God provided David a capital city. He carved out a specific place for service. So too, God will establish you in a place he provides as confirmation of his purposes. God establishes us when others are blessed and helped through our service. David was established for the sake of the blessing of the nation. We know we are being established in an area of service when others are blessed. And when others see God in us and experience his presence through us, then we know we are being established in the purposes of God. Don't be afraid to celebrate what God is doing. For as you trust God, he will establish you for his purposes. It is a joyful place to be. And are you going to sit it out or dance? I hope you dance.